So when did the bad guys become the good guys? You guys notice that in the last, 10 years? Seems like there's a lot of movies coming out or a lot of TV shows coming out where they take the villain and they make them the hero. We got Loki. We've got Despicable Me. Hey, look, I'm a millennial, all right, which means I love Minions. And I'm not ashamed of it. They're funny. I don't care who you are. There's movies that come out that highlight the bad guy, right? How about the Book of Boba Fett? He was like the baddest dude in Star Wars Episode 5, and now he's a hero. And the Sand People are also good now, apparently. Okay, I was reading an article a few weeks ago from this thing called the Gospel Coalition, and they talk about this kind of cultural phenomenon that's happening, where we're taking the hero, or we're taking the villain, we're making them the hero. And part of what I think works about that, or at least what one of the authors was saying about this, is we resonate with the hero, but we also resonate with the villain on some level. And when you look at the villain's story, like Loki, he's this narcissistic sociopath who just keeps murdering thousands of people, but it's because he was hurt first. And so then there's just a little part of us where we're like, yeah, me too, I was hurt too, and part of what that's doing is it's almost comforting us a little bit, where we're saying, okay, they're not that bad, so maybe I'm not that bad. But part of what's also underlying this narrative that's being told time and time again right now in pop culture is we are just as capable of evil. Like if Loki's really a good guy on the inside and he does this evil, what about us? Something we've been talking a lot about in Romans is this idea of sin, right? The idea of sin, and how we hammered it hard for chapters 1 through 3, and we talked about how we're all broken, how we're all sinful, how we're all rebellion, how we're all on the hook. It doesn't matter who we are, all of us have this issue. But something we haven't quite gotten to yet, in Romans at least, is where did that problem come from? Where does sin have its origin? Where is it based? Because I don't know about you, but sin is something that when you look around, everybody deals with and everybody has. Maybe if you're a parent in here, you've seen it in your kids. They have problems. And then you realize that those problems are really your problems. Not just because you have to discipline them, but because they're like you. The other day, my mom showed me this picture of me as a baby. And I was mad and crying, and my face was all scrunched up. And I looked at the picture, and I saw my daughter. That's Addie's face. I thought she looked like Mom. She doesn't when she's mad. We know it, of course, that's a facial expression, right? But the further along you guys go in this parenting journey, you start to see things replicated from who you are. That is a replication of something called sin in you. There's sin in you. And then we see it replicated in our kids as well. We see it replicated in our world. We see it in our workplace, whether it's certain behaviors we have there, or whether we see it in our family relationships. We see it as we relate to other people. Sin seems to have this viral effect where it's in us, but it also spreads to others. So where does it come from? Well, Paul just got done giving us this relieving news that it's this reality in Romans 5:8 that God has demonstrated his own love toward us in this, that while we were still sinners, while we were still messed up, God chose to die for us and to pay for our sin. While we were still enemies to him, he dies for us. That's him demonstrating his love, showing his love to us. That is part of the good news of the gospel that Paul's proclaiming. But where he goes next is he says, hey, this is really good news, and I need you to understand how all-encompassing this good news is, because it's bigger than you think. It's not just about you, it's about all of us. And so here's our summary statement for this morning. Sin did not start with us, but it surely hasn't ended with us. From Adam to Moses and everyone in between, and everyone since, sin has led to death. The first sin set humanity on a course for destruction, but the first perfect man has set us on an even more powerful course for redemption. That's where Paul's going to go with us. But we're just going to talk about the first half of that, which is how we ended up in this horrible place. You guys excited for that? Yeah, I'm really excited. It's going to be great. Buckle up. What we're going to do is we're actually going to walk through the text kind of just a phrase at a time, because I want you to see how Paul's argument builds first. I want you to see how it builds. So let me pray for us, and then we'll jump right in. So God, we love you. We thank you that even though the natural inclination of our hearts is to not run to you, to not want you, God, you still wanted us. And that's a truth and that's a gift that we can't really understand at the depth of what it is. But I pray today that as we examine your text, that it would examine us and that we would start to see these glimmers of the grace that you've given us and that would give us hope, God. We love you. It's in your son's name we pray. Everybody said, amen. So we're picking up in chapter 5, verse 12, and it says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all have sinned. Paul is talking about a doctrine, which is just a teaching of the church called original sin. It means the very first sin had a beginning point. And that very first sin began with the very first man. The very first man chose to sin, which meant he chose his way instead of God's way. And because of that, there is death in the world. When you read the first few chapters of Genesis, you see that the result of the sin that Adam and Eve committed was that death would reign in this world. And that's one of the most true things about our world. Death has reigned on this planet. When you look around, death is rampant. It's everywhere. Suffering is everywhere. There's this guy named N.T. Wright. He's a New Testament theologian. And one of the things he wrote in a book called Evil and the Suffering of God is he talked about the reality that we like to insulate ourselves from evil and suffering. Well, some of that's good, right? Like, we shouldn't choose pain just for fun of it, CrossFitters out there. We shouldn't just choose pain unless there's a gain. Amen, somebody. All right. We don't just choose that. What we do is we start to build this kind of fence around ourselves and we insulate ourselves from evil and from suffering. Part of that is good. But what that does on the back end is it leaves our system in a state of shock anytime we see evil or we experience suffering. We've insulated ourselves so much that we have a knee-jerk reaction to these things that aren't surprising in the Bible. When you read through God's word, it's not surprising that there's evil or there's suffering. It's not something that God hides in the back corner in the way that he related to humanity. Part of what we've done in our world of 2020, 2023 is we've kind of polished everything and sanitized everything to where the idea of evil or suffering is an intrusion on our life. It's shocking to our life. What's interesting is that it's not shocking to God. God knows this is reality. God knows this is what exists, and he gives us the information that it started with us. Evil starts with humanity. Evil starts with the first sin, and because of that, death reigns. But where that's left us is maybe feeling like that's a little bit unfair. Really, God? Sin and death keeps wreaking sin and death? That doesn't seem fair. Really, one person messed it up for all of us? Well, he does us a favor and says it's not just that one person sinned, so now we have this sinful nature, this proclivity toward evil, but also we keep sinning. So we keep doing the things that lead to that. We keep doing sin, and because of that, it's rampant in our world. You know, it took us about 80 years or so to forget that we're fundamentally evil as humanity. See, if you dial back the clock to like the 1940s, there's World War II, and there's the Holocaust, and there's what happened in Russia, and you have millions of people dying worldwide because of these ideologies that looked as human beings as less than. Following World War II, the ground falls out from under the humanists. So these are the people who thought, you know what, humanity is progressing, we're getting better if we can just be nicer to each other and if we can just keep growing as human, if we just have progress and enough technology and enough industrial revolution or whatever, we can become good, we can become perfect. And then World War II, the Holocaust, everything that happens in Russia happens, boom, the floor falls out from under them, and you have what's called the existentialist movement. So you have a guy named Jean-Paul Sartre who writes a book called Nausea. Okay, so he comes out of World War II, and what he says is everything just started to make him sick. It's written from the perspective of another person, it's a narrative, but what he says is he would walk around and see a tree, and the tree would just make him want to throw up because that tree wasn't going to be there in 2,000 years. He would go and look at a watch, and it just made him want to puke because he saw the time running out on his life. He would go to the library and see books and imagine how no one's ever going to read all these books, and it would just make him depressed. Welcome to Vintage Grace. Super glad you're here. Please stick with me. I promise this won't all be depressing. But he writes in Nausea about that. And then where he gets to is he says, so we have to make meaning out of something. We have to have some sort of purpose because, well, nothing really has any purpose. So we need to make something purposeful. And that actually became the prevailing mode of thought because of how bad things were. But now, 80 years removed, we're living in a world where we're just inventing meaning left and right. We're just coming up with new things that we're calling the purpose or the reason for your life left and right. And we've forgotten how the culture even got there. But what God teaches us in the Bible through the doctrine of original sin is that what happened in the 40s was not surprising. What happens beyond then, if you look at what happened in like Rwanda or the Sudanese Civil War, what's happening there is not surprising because of the doctrine of original sin. All of us are intrinsically evil because of what happened with Adam, but also because of what we continue to choose to do. That's what the idea of original sin means. And so sin has had its reign. Sin has had its full bore go after it until God decides to do something about it. But before we get there, we have to stop with the California stop. Okay, so how many of you guys know what the California stop is? Okay, see, Paul knew about the California stop too. That's why he wrote this verse. It says, "For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given. But sin is not counted where there is no law." What he's getting at is a faulty viewpoint of the world that says, hey, well, I didn't know, so it must not be wrong. Another way of putting it is, no cop, no stop. That's just what I was taught. I don't know. I don't know why they let me up here today. You feel it sometimes when you drive down Sophia Parkway. You know what it is. You know what I'm talking about. You're rolling and it's like another stop sign, another. Really? They had to put this here? Yes, it's so that I don't treat it like a highway. It's very simple. And yet what happens sometimes, and what's so insidious about this mentality is it's not just rolling through a stop sign. We're talking about the things that we hide that other people don't see. And we think that if there's not a specific law against it, or if there's not a specific verse against it, maybe it's not bad. Paul's saying, no, what's wrong is wrong and has always been wrong. It doesn't matter if you make Loki the hero, he's still the villain. It's still evil. What he does is still evil. This is a warning to us, saying, look, what's God's truth about the best way this thing is supposed to work has always been God's truth, whether or not the law was present. And so to prove his point, he takes us on a journey. And I'm gonna take you on a journey. You guys ready? We're gonna cover the entire book of Genesis through the beginning of Exodus. Are you ready? Yeah. Here we go. You're like, man, I get double sermon today. This is great. Here we go. It says, death reigned from Adam to Moses. What do you think was being called to mind for the people that he was writing to at that time? So he's writing to this Jewish audience in the Roman church who were Christian, who were coming back. He's writing to some of the Roman Christians who were there. He says, from Adam to Moses, death reigned. I think for them, they would have immediately pulled together stories. They would have immediately pieced together what Paul was talking about. But for us, some of the beauty of the Old Testament sometimes gets lost in just the Sunday school flannel graph that we heard years ago, but we haven't spent as much time with this. We haven't spent as much time with what God has revealed to us through these stories and through what had happened. And so what I want to do is take a minute to look at it, and here's why. How many of you guys have ever heard of a genogram? A genogram. It's not the Enneagram. Don't cancel me. It is a genogram, okay? And the genogram is something that's used in like family systems theory, okay? So let's say you're going to counseling and you're trying to understand something that's going on, a pattern that you have, some behavior, something that happened in your family. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll have you draw something called a genogram, where you map out your family tree. So you take a little circle, you draw yourself, you draw your mom, your dad, their mom, their dad, your stepdad, you draw your husband, you draw everything, you draw out your kids, and you go back as far as you can go, right? You make your family tree. And then you do something that you never show your family tree. You write down everything that was wrong with them, okay? So you go in there and you're like, okay, this guy had this problem. This one was a chronic liar. This one is gambling. This one's alcoholic. This one got divorced. You list all these things where you're like, hey, these are just some things that happened or some traumas in the past. And this one struggled with anxiety, whatever it is, you write them all down. And then what you'll find is some of those things seem to carry all the way from up here, all the way down to you and to your children. Now, what can happen with the genogram is it becomes a little bit fatalistic, where we say, okay, well then there's nothing I can do with this. That's not the hope of the gospel. What the hope of the gospel is that whatever your family history is, whatever your background or your baggage is, there's hope for that. There's a way around that. But before we get to that, let's examine some of our baggage as the people of God. You ready? Let's start with Adam. What did Adam do? She did it. It was all her. It was definitely her. See, Adam, he gets this job from God. It was pretty simple. Don't eat from the tree and, be fruitful and multiply, that whole thing. All right? Take care of things in the garden. And he's like, got it. And then God creates woman, and then they do the whole fruitful and multiply thing. And then he abdicates responsibility. So he does not do his job. In fact, we don't really see anywhere in the Bible where Adam tells Eve what the rules were. It's kind of interesting. You see, what Adam does is he just abdicates what his role was. And Eve, she ends up falling victim to temptation, and she ends up sinning herself, brings the fruit to Adam, and then Adam sins, and they both realize, what have we done? And then immediately they hide. So you have hiding shows up on the scene. You have abdicating responsibility, you have hiding, and then as soon as God shows up, he's like, Adam, where are you at? Now, Adam wasn't the first guy to eat the fruit, right? Obviously, it's Eve's fault. That's not how God treated that. He said, hey, I'm gonna talk to you. He talks to Adam, and he looks at both of them, and he says, hey, here's gonna be the result of this. And then you see blame shifting happen. Adam shifts blame to Eve. Eve shifts blame, say that 6 times fast, to the serpent. It only takes one generation after that for things to get even worse. So you have Cain and Abel. They're some of the first descendants, right? And Cain, he's one of the brothers. Abel's one of the brothers. Abel goes in. He goes to give this sacrifice to God. And it is a beautiful sacrifice. It was a pleasing aroma to God. And then Cain shows up and he just kind of, and then God says, Cain, you messed this one up. But Abel, wow. And then Cain looks at Abel and says, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. And then he does. He commits the first murder. What do we have there? We have sibling rivalry. We have rage. We have murder. What happens next? Well, let's just pick up with Noah. Here's what the Bible tells us about what's happening by the time Noah's on the scene. All right, Genesis 6, verse 5 says this. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's what he saw. He saw sin and death reigning. He saw sin and death having its way. And then it says something that it's hard to swallow. He says, and then the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. See, God loved what he created. What he made was good. And he's grieved by the way that sin and death were wreaking havoc, by the choices that humanity kept making. And so God decides to hit the reset. He selects a guy named Noah and calls Noah to build this ark. And when they're done going through that, when God wipes the slate clean, then, you know what the first thing Noah does is? He gets hammered. Can I say that in church? I don't know. He gets absolutely hammered. Now here's how bad it is. The dude plants a vineyard. He had to plant a vineyard first. That's how he was ready for it. So he builds the vineyard, he waits for the grapes to grow, goes through the whole fermentation process, however that works, and then gets absolutely hammered. Passes out in his tent, and then poor son of his walks into the tent and sees him naked. Someone's like, did he say naked at church? It's in the Bible. You can take it up with God. I'm sorry. So he walks in and he sees him, and then he goes out and gets his brothers. He's like, guys, no, what happened? They go in, and the brothers, they're like, hey, hold up. They get a sheet and they walk in backwards and throw it over their dad to honor and to respect him. What's going on in this story? There's drunkenness, there's shame, and then there's a strain in a parent-child relationship. So what happens is Noah ends up kicking out the son who had came in, and then you have the land of Canaan. That's where you get the Canaanites who show up later in the Bible. You have this strain in that relationship. You have favoritism happening. That happens again further down the line. You've got Abraham. What does Abraham do? Abraham lies multiple times. We said it a few weeks ago. He has failure to launch. He was chilling in his basement. His mom and dad were like, when are you gonna get a job? And God calls him into something, He says yes, but then as he goes, he lies, he doubts, and we end up seeing, at least recorded in the Bible, one of the first affairs. That's our spiritual history. And then there's Isaac. What does Isaac do? Isaac also abdicates some of his role. You see, when Jacob and Esau come in and they trick him, Isaac abdicates some of his responsibility. There's a strained parent and child relationship because Isaac has favoritism over Esau. He prefers Esau over Jacob. And that's part of what creates this enmity between Esau and Jacob. And then, what happens with Esau and Jacob? Well, Jacob's a liar, right? So he's just flat out liar. His name means liar. His name means trickster. That's what it means. And so Jacob is a great baby name if you're looking for one. Jacob, what he does is he goes and he tricks his father, and he ends up in a conflict with Esau. And you know what they do? Esau wants to murder him again. Sound familiar? Sound like the Cain and Abel thing? He wants to murder him. And then they go their separate ways, which means they were great at resolving conflict. And we've been suffering from it ever since, right? They decide to go their separate ways. And then there's murderous intent. There's conspiracy to murder. There's irreconcilable differences. They choose not to forgive each other. There's bitterness. Joseph and his brothers. We're almost to Moses, so hang on. Joseph and his brothers. What happens? There's favoritism again, where he prefers Joseph over the other brother, gives him this nice coat. And so what do the brothers do? Well, if you had 12 older brothers or 11 older brothers, they'd probably jump you too. So they jump him, they throw him in a pit, and then he gets sold off into slavery. And then they lie. They tell their dad, oh, he was killed. They put a bunch of animal blood all over his jacket and say, look, he died. There's deception, sibling rivalry, rage, there's envy. And then you have Moses. So years later, when Moses comes on the scene, we have one of the first, we have manslaughter, right? So he accidentally kills this slaver who was hurting these Hebrew people. So he kills him, and then he flees, he runs. And then when it's time for Moses to go, when God calls him to go and rescue his people, he abdicates leadership. He gets rid of responsibility. He's like, not me. I stutter. And so God's like, all right, really, we're gonna have to do it this way? Okay, I'm gonna go get your cousin, and your cousin, he can spit some bars, and then you can just stand there with the stick and do your magic tricks, okay? So he gets that together and sends him on his way, and they do these miracles, and they end up rescuing the people of Israel out of Egypt and into the promised land. But Moses had an anger problem. He had rage. And at the end of his life, what he chooses to do is he was so fed up with the people of Israel. And I mean, who wouldn't be, right? The amount of things that they do in the wilderness and the wandering, like definitely me. But what he ends up doing is he strikes a rock and performs a miracle, a work of God out of a place of sin. God says, I can't let you into the promised land. You see, this story, this narrative that we see in Genesis, these historical events that happen with the people of God, they comprise our spiritual heritage. These are things that all of us find ourselves doing at different times. And there's probably things on this list that you would say that you've done, and there's probably things that aren't on the list that you've done, which is why Paul says, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam. He's saying we're covering all the bases here. You know, if you consider just that history of sin from Adam all the way through those patriarchs, we kind of get a picture of what we're working with here as humanity. This is a humanity problem. This is an everywhere problem. All of these things are all over this world. But you know what also happened in every one of those stories? God showed grace. God showed grace in every single one of those instances. You can go back through and you can see how God showed up for Adam and Eve even after they screwed it up. You know what God does? God makes them clothes. God made them clothes. After they had hidden themselves with something that could barely cover them, God makes clothes for them. God provides for them. God has grace for them. God shows up with Noah. He finds favor for Noah. Noah didn't do anything to find favor with God. He was a sinner just like the rest of us, and yet he finds favor with God. God calls Noah. Same with Abraham. God still makes a promise to Abraham. You know what is interesting is God kept making promises to people that kept breaking promises. So he makes a promise to Adam. He says, hey, I'm gonna make you, and you're gonna go, and you're gonna be fruitful, you're gonna multiply, you're gonna have reign and dominion over the earth. And he says, no, I want to give my dominion of the earth over to sin. And so sin reigns, and sin has dominion. But he makes a promise with Adam about what his role was to be, about what the role of humanity is. Then he makes a promise with Noah. He says, I'm gonna put down my bow. I'm going to not fire on the earth in the same way that I just did. So he makes this promise to Noah. He makes a promise to Abraham that his descendants would be greater than the grains of sand, would be greater than the stars in the sky. He makes this double promise to him. He makes a promise to Moses. He has this covenant, this new covenant that's made on Mount Sinai, this contract between God and his people of here's what it means to be the people of God. And they break it while they're making it. While Moses is up there making the covenant, they're breaking everything that he's just about to promise to God. You see, God has grace in all of those situations. He kept promising and he kept being faithful. And he's the one who has the rescue from these things. He's the one who has the rescue from our proclivity toward evil, the inclination of our heart toward evil, which is why Paul says that this Adam that he's talking about is a type of the one to come. That means he is our spiritual ancestor, our theological ancestor, our historical ancestor, and he is a type of a new man that would show up, and that would show us how this thing is really supposed to work. And that person he's talking about, the type, is the type of Jesus. And so when Jesus comes, what he does is he does the exact opposite of Adam. He does everything that God says. He follows perfectly. And then he's murdered for it. And you see, his typology of who Christ is becomes a picture for us of what it means to be faithful to God, but it also becomes a replacement for us of being right with God. So he takes our place and is right with God for us so that we can follow him and we can give our lives to him and be formed by his character. That's how that works. And the way that God does that is through Jesus. In fact, what it says in the next verse, which I'm gonna save for Drew next week because, we're almost out of time here. But here's what it says. It says, but the free gift, AKA the gift of God, is not like the trespass. So what Paul's doing is he's setting up this analogy and he says, look at all these things about original sin and how it works and how it started and what it is. And then he says, but it's nothing like what Jesus does. Because what Jesus does is more all-encompassing than the reign of death and sin. What Jesus does is more freeing. What Jesus does changes your trajectory in a way unlike your hang-ups, unlike the baggage that you carry from your family, unlike the baggage you're giving to your kids right now. The free gift of God is different from that. Here's one way I like to think of it, and I got this wrong last service, but somebody helped me out, okay? In 1968, you guys ever heard of the high jump? See, I thought it was a pole jump because I don't know sports ball or sports run, which is the other kind of sports apparently. So there's this thing called the high jump, right? It's this Olympic event, and people run and they jump. They try to get over this stick. It's a classic game. It's played globally. It's great. You guys should try it. Here's the problem. There were like a few different ways that you could actually do it. So people had this mindset of, okay, I'm gonna jump with my legs spread, I'm gonna bring my knees to my chest, and I'm gonna see how high I can get over it. And then this dude shows up on the scene. His name's Fosbury. Poor Fosbury. It's an unfortunate last name. Sorry if that is your last name, because it had alliteration with flop. So the Fosbury flop comes into play, right? Some of you were alive when this happened. And he runs up and he does one of these. Right, he does the dolphin, he flips on his back and gets over the pole. And now, every time that we watch the Olympics, we're like, what are they doing? And the people run, they go, yoop, and they flop over the pole. They get over it higher. Now, some people tell this story, and here's how they do it. Humanity's so great. We gotta look for a different perspective and a different way to be better and to overcome. Yay, let's all go home. That's actually not the full story. You know what happened? Somebody changed the course. Somebody changed the way the game was played. What they did is they changed the pit that they fall into when they jump. The flop wasn't invented by Fosbury. Fosbury wasn't the first person to do it. It happened before, but people couldn't do it because it was too dangerous. But then they changed the way that the course works, where now, if you jump over, you land in a safer place. You can actually do the flop and get as high as you possibly can over the bar. Guys, the typology of Jesus, what he does, it changed the course. It changed the whole way that the game is played. Okay, it's no longer about you being perfect. It's no longer about you overcoming on your own. It's no longer about you pulling it all together and mustering up the courage and making it happen. He changed the entire course, where it's like, and this is probably not helpful, but we just kind of flop into God. We're like, okay, God's gonna catch us, right? And so we make these mistakes and we look silly as we do it, and we jump over the bar, but God's there catching us and supporting us. And God says, okay, I know you're gonna fail, I know you're gonna mess up, but I've now changed the course to where when you follow Jesus and you want his character to start to define your character, and you want him to start to help you break away the bondage of generational sin and the sin and the inclination of your own heart, Jesus makes up the difference. He doesn't just make up the difference, he does it for you. He did it for us on the cross, so that when we're following him, when we receive this gift, it's not like the trespass. It's a different kind of gift. That's great news. Because I don't know about you, but there's probably things that you have in your life, there's things that I have in my life that I wish I could just get over. But I know that the only way to do it is to recognize where the rescue comes from. It's not going to be me figuring it out myself. And that's not something that we like to hear in a world that just keeps creating its own meaning out of nothing. But it's not about us figuring it out ourselves. That's why we need rescue. We need rescue. And the only rescue that we have that's actually going to make it work is God as our rescue. God is our rescue. He's the one who meets us in that place of recognizing our dependence on him. He's the one who meets us in a place of recognizing that we can't save ourselves. But when we do that, he extends grace to us. He extends grace. You know, there's this moment in Exodus where God reveals his character to Moses. He reveals his character, and it's Exodus 34. And it says this: "Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord." So he gives Moses a name by which to call him. He says, "Call me the Lord." And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin." This is God's character. He is a God of grace. He is a God of love. He is a God who is steadfast, meaning unshakingly, unwaveringly committed to his promise to us to make us right with him. And then it says something at the back half of verse 7. It says, "Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished." It means God is loving, but God is also just. He doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. And he visits this punishment on the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the third and the fourth generation. What it's saying is sin has a damaging effect generationally. It will. And so the decisions you're making for your family and what you're doing with your life, it's going to impact your kids and their kids for generations. The place that you are right now is probably impacted by generations that came before you. But what Jesus does is he takes the weight of what that would be and he breaks it. So that no matter what you come in here with, whatever limiting belief you have about what God wants to do in your life or how God could rescue you or change you from the inside out, Jesus comes and he breaks that chain and he breaks that perspective and he does it for us. And so then what we're left to do, what we're invited into, is a place of chasing after God and then continually repenting for the ways that we miss it. And so that's part of the gift of communion. If you guys have your elements, we're gonna take communion in just a minute, but we're gonna do it a little bit differently than what we typically do. Typically we take it all together, but today what I want us to do is to spend some time thinking about what are those natural inclinations of your heart toward evil. What are some of those things that you naturally lean toward? It's part of who you are, it's part of your wiring, it's part of your family history, it's part of what you, if you're honest with yourself, you like. What are those things? And then what I want you to do is I want you to think of the reality, think of the fact that God is real and God paid for that. He paid for that so that you would be rescued from that by him and live a life of grace and devotion and adoration because you recognize what God has done for you. That's part of what the gift of communion is for us. Like when we gather as believers, we come to remember what Jesus did. And so what I want us to do now is just take a moment, reflect where you are, and think about what God has done to rescue you If you have something you need to surrender to him, surrender that before you take your bread and your wine. Just sit there and say, God, what do I need to give to you right now? And just do some time with Jesus. Let him work in your heart.